It's a pleasure to introduce President of the Brazilian Mathematical Society and L'Oreal laureate, Jaqueline Mesquita, professor of the Universidade of Brasilia, and she will be speaking about generalized ODEs and other types of equations.
Thank you very much for this introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and to participate on this event. It's always a great pleasure to come here in INSA. So thank you very much for the organizers for the invitation. And I will try to be more like not too specific. I will try to be not too technical and try to give some ideas concerning my field. So, first, this type of equation, the generalized ODE, started to be investigated by Jaqueline. He was very interested about the behavior of this Kafka. And if you see the equation that describes the behavior of the family, the functions that appears in the equation are very highly oscillating functions. So we have that Lebesgue integral was not able to integrate this type of function because they are very highly oscillating functions. And since Jaqueline would like to investigate about this type of problem, he needed to introduce a more general type of integral that could be able to integrate highly oscillating functions. So in this moment, it appears in the literature this type of integral that can integrate more functions than Lebesgue integrals because it also encompasses these types of highly oscillating functions. At the same time, but completely independent, we have that Hensel investigating other types of problems. He also needed to introduce a more general type of integral, and he also came with a new definition of integration. And after many years, they found out that both types of integrals were equivalent. And that's why this integral called Kurzweil-Hensel integral or Hensel-Kurzweil integral. And here is one example just to see. So here we have this type of function here, and this function is given by these two equalities. And it's possible to calculate the derivative of this function. And what we have, if we see, we have that the derivative is very highly oscillating function. You can see by this it's very highly oscillating, so this is not a Lebesgue integrable function, but it is Kurzweil-Hensel integrable. And also Fermat integrable because both are equivalent. So now I will very quickly I will try to introduce this type of integral. Actually, I will introduce a more general one. That's because after that Kurzweil and Hensel, they introduced this type of integral. Years later, Kurzweil would like to investigate more about Kafka problem, and he would like to prove some averaging principles for this type of equation. Because usually when you have averaging principle, what we have approximation of the solution of the problem. And in order to do that, he needed to introduce such a type of general equation. And to do that, he needed a more general concept of integral. So he generalized the concept of the integral that includes also Kurzweil-Hensel integral, also the types of Stieltjes integral, and other types of integrals. I will try to find this here. So first, it's very simple, the definition that appears in this integral. We started with a tag division of some interval AB. So here we divided this interval in subintervals, and in each subinterval we choose a tag. It's very similar what happens with a Riemann integral. So here is the main difference between the Riemann integral and the Kurzweil integral. Because here what we have this function that's called the gauge, that's only a positive function. When we are dealing with a Riemann integral, what we have is that this gauge is constant. But here, when we deal with this type of integral, what we have is that this function is positive. And we can calibrate this part So we can run away from the discontinuity, from the part that your function behaves bad. So here, what we have this function that's called gauge, and a second division is called delta phi if we have this inclusion here. So with this in hand, what we have here is a definition of a Kurzweil integrable function. So we say that a function that we define here is Kurzweil integrable. Here is more general than Kurzweil integrable, Kurzweil-Haskell, and also Kurzweil-Haskell too. I will show that. So if we have that this inequality here happens, and in this case we use this notation. I think, yeah, it doesn't work very well, the pointer, but yeah. So here what we have that this is the notation that we have. And in order to ensure that this integral is well defined, we have a disco lemma that we have like given a gauge that always exists a tangent division delta phi of our interval. And here, I will only show something that since I mentioned that this is more general than others, depending how you define your U, we can have that this is the Hertog-Kurzweil integral, or you can have that is also Kurzweil-Haskell still integral. So if you define your U now as equal F tau F, so what happens is that the integral that you see there, you have this type of integral here. So like that, here AB. So here we have a type of Kurzweil-Haskell integral. But if you define your function in this way here, like F tau GF, so now what we have is a type of Still's integral. So we can have these two encompassed in this case here of this general definition of Kurzweil. And one thing that's very nice is because usually when you need to introduce Ledec integrals, you need all the measure theory behind. But here you do not need this measure theory. So we can introduce very similar what we have for Riemann integrals, but we only use this Heidelberg function as the gauge. So, but here we are interested about the generalized ODE. So this comes from this type of integrals. And Jaqueline introduced this class of equations. And here Stefan Schwab was his PhD student. And he also made a lot of contributions for the generalized ODE. So, but what's that class of equations? So here, what happens is the following. So we have that a function x. We say that the solution of the generalized ODEs that we denoted by these parts in blue that you can see, if it satisfies this integral equation. So if you see for a moment, maybe you can think that it means that x is differentiable with respect of tau. But no, this is only a notation that Jaqueline introduced it. But here, the generalized ODE is a type of integral equation. So it's only a notation that we use it, but to be a solution of a generalized ODE, you will need that it satisfies this integral equation, which means that your solution does not need to be differentiable. So we can have here like a discontinuous solution. And that's why it's so nice in this type of theory, because sometimes you have in the real world when you would like to would like to model some phenomena, you sometimes have that your solution is discontinuous. And here we have that because of this type of definition, we can have in this class that your solution is discontinuous depending how you define your problem. And the good thing behind of the generalized ODE is because it can encompass many types of equations inside of it. So we can have a lot of results to many types of equations using correspondence with the generalized ODE. I will talk about this correspondence, but it's possible, depending how you define your capital F that appears in the generalized ODE, we can have a relation with the generalized ODE and ordinary differential equations, dynamic equations, time scales, measured differential equations, delay differential equation. So we can have this relation between generalized ODs and all these types of equations. So we can prove a result for generalized ODs and then translate this result for all these types of equations. And the one thing that Jaqueline made in that time, he would like to prove operating principles for the capital problem, and he proved main continuous dependence on parameter result. And in order to do that, he used generalized OD, and when he translated this for ordinary differential equations, he had much more general types of hypotheses, like not the usual ones that we have like boundness and Lipschitz, but under the integral, when you have like Lipschitz under the integral, you have a more general type of function. So your function does not need to be continuous. Your function can be only regulated. So we can have much more generality when we come from generalized volume. So I will start with this first type of equation here, the measure differential equation, but I will try to bring here all the correspondence between generalized ODs and all the types of equations, and I will try to introduce a little about all those types of equations. I will start here with the measure differential equation. So here, usually the measure differential equation, here we have that it's denoted using distributional derivatives here. So here concerns f and here concerns g. And then we have that b problem corresponding this integral form. But here it's important to pay attention one thing. We have this equivalent with this integral form when we are dealing with Lebesgue integrals. When we deal with a Kurzweil COD integral, we do not have this correspondence. But if you are dealing with Lebesgue integrals, we have this correspondence. But we can also work with this integral equation here and have the relation with generalized. And if you see this type of equation, this measure differential equation, are more general than ordinary differential equations, because here we have the g, and this g, as we will see today, when you have that, your solution can be discontinuous. It will be dependent on the regularity of g. So if your g is continuous, so your x is continuous. But if your g is not continuous, you have that your x is not continuous. So it will depend. And also, we can have a relation between this type of equation and impulsive equation. So we can also put some impulsive behavior inside of our G here. So this is more general than ordinary differential equation. And what we have here, we have that this type of integral can be approached by this sum here, that the a type of Riemann sum that we have for the type of Kurzweil integral. And then what we have is the following. So if you define the capital F of the generalized OD equal this integral here, so then we have that the difference here by the definition is equal to this integral, and using the properties concerning the integral, we can have this approach here. And using that, we have that this integral here can be approached by this Riemann sum that we have here, and then using the previous one, that this one can be approached by this, and using the sum we have that these two can be corresponding. And then what we have a relation between this measured type of expression and the generalized. So here, if you have a solution for the generalized OD, we can have a solution for the measured differential equation. So all the results that we have for generalized OD, we can translate to these types of equations. Also here, I will talk about this other class of equations, that's functional differential equations. But before to talk about the correspondence between generalized OD and this type of equation, I will try to bring some motivation of these types of equations, since I'm not sure if everybody here is familiar with this type of equation. So this investigation about functional differential equations, it started to appear in the literature with Platon. And Platon, actually, he was studying other types of problems, PDH problems, but doing some calculations appears in some moments delayed differential equations in his manuscript. And in that moment, it started to appear the techniques to solve this type of problem. Then later, we have that Vito Volterra started to realize the importance to consider this type of equation that's called functional differential equation, because usually we consider a delay time in between. So here he mentioned that in all biological phenomena, it's necessary to examine not only immediate action, but all those depending on the past. And what happens here when you have delay equation, we really take into account the influence of the past in the present and in the future. So it's very important when you deal with a delay equation. Also, we have that Picard was a plenary speaker in ICM in 1908. And in his plenary talk, he also mentioned about the delay differential equation. Mentioned that it's very important to investigate many types of phenomena to consider this delay term in your equation. However, he also mentioned about the difficulties behind of this type of equation. So here only to bring some ideas. I know that everybody here is very familiar with the population model, but only for you to understand the meaning of this delayed equation. So I will bring this type. So here, when you think about the population model, we have that the first manuscript about this came from John Grant. John Grant only using about observation and writing the data about population, like the death and the birth. He has this manuscript here. And then everybody knows Thomas Malthus that also has some a model for population. He didn't bring some population model in terms of mathematics, but he mentioned that the increasing of the population would be exponentially, so we can describe it in an equation. And then we have the branch that probably many people know here that came after Thomas Malthus and said, no, the increase of the population needs to be limited by some variables. And here we have the logistic equation that's very famous that everybody saw at some moment. So here's the logistic equation. And then some years later, we have that Hudson was one of the first to start to think that it was something that should be adjusted in the logistic equation. And why that? Because if you see, when the person birth, we know that it's not possible to reproduce as soon as you birth, okay, in your birth. So this time in between the birth and to enter in the maturation process, you need to account it. It's called the delay. And then he was one of the first to bring a model putting the delay in the population model. So here he put this tall here, as you see, in this population model. And maybe you are seeing that and you think, okay, but this is not a big difference. He only put this delay in the equation and it will not change very much the behavior of the solution. However, this small delay can change completely the behavior of the solution. So here is the solution of the logistic equation, and here is the solution of Hudson equation. So if you see that small term, that the delay, it affects a lot the behavior of the solution. So it's very important to consider this type of delay of term in your equation, because it can affect a lot the behavior of the solution, and of course the remarks that we will do concerning the phenomena. So it will be very important to consider it. And after that, many people realized that there were some problem with the equation of Hudson, because if you back here in the Hudson equation, what happens if you do here like descriptive here? B and K is positive. And what happens is that we put the delay in the negative term. which means that we put the delay in the death rate, not in the correct rate. So years later, they realized that, and many researchers started to investigate it about this equation, and they changed it, putting the the delay in the positive part that it was expected. So here we have the contributions of Newton, and also from these three Brazilian, Paris, Malta, and Coutinho, that they made a lot of contributions in this type of equation. And this equation was known as low-fi equation because they made a lot of experiments with a low-fi population. Because if you see the low-fi population, it's very important to understand this population to consider the delay, because it's very highly oscillating the population. It's not, it does not behave as logistic equation, but it has this type of oscillation. So here, depending how you consider your delay, we can have different types of behavior. So if your delay is equal to 2, we have this behavior. If your delay is equal to 6, we can have this other one. So depending how you consider your delay, we can have different types of behavior. And it's important to mention that later, many researchers realized that even constant delays are not so good, because the timing for the population enter in the maturation process is not constant, but it can vary depending many things, depending on the state, depending many other variables. So here also we can consider like not only constant delay, but also time-dependent delay, state-dependent delay, but they are much more complicated to view. So just to mention here about the notation that we have here for this type of equations that are the functional differential equations, we use this notation that appears like the partial derivative, but it's not. Here is the notation for a function, and what we have is that the x of t is like a function that applies theta, and then you have that this is x of t plus theta. So what we have here, we are in the space of functions. So now we are in the infinite dimensional spaces. So here again, we needed to deal with this type of spaces, and we have much more complications. Also, we can consider here infinity delay. So here is for infinity delay, finite delay, so here's the bounded intervals, but also we can have infinity delay. But again, it's much more difficult because we needed to find the appropriate space to define our solution. Also, other things that happen here, first is because we have for ODE, usually we deal with finite dimensional space, and for functional differential equations, we deal with infinity dimensional space. So here we have much more complications from this point. Also, what we have here is about the initial condition. So when we deal with a delay equation, our initial condition is a function. And when you deal with ODEs, our initial condition is only, it's not a function. So you know in the moment 0 what's happening with your solution. But here we have a function. And even when you deal with numerical approximation for computer, it's much more complicated when you deal with delay equation, because you know your solution in that moment, and this moment affects your solution in the next one. And this will affect the other one. So when you do like a computer, when you try to computer it using computation, you need like to integrate your solution many times. So it's much more complicated, even for the computer, to have the solution for simulation. So it's much more difficult to do with this type of delay. So here, as I mentioned before, we can have many types of delays. So here's the time-dependent delay. Here, the state-dependent delay. That means that your delay depends on the state. So we can have many different types of delay. And I would like only to mention that it seems very beautiful, but it also has a lot of applications behind of this type of application. So here I will mention some applications that we can have using delay equation. So here first, it's about medicine. We have a lot of literature about that, many different models that consider the time in between you take the medicine and it starts to do effect. So we know that usually it's not instantaneously unless you have some injection, but this time between you take the medicine and it starts to do effect, it also needs to be accounted. So here we also have many different types of models in this direction. Also the epidemiology. So we know the past we had the pandemics of the COVID-19. And this type of equations were very important because we know that, for example, COVID-19 is a type of a disease that has incubation period, which means that you are infected with COVID-19, but the symptoms do not appear like instantaneously, but it takes time between you be infected and the symptoms appear. And this time can be interpreted as delay. So, and that's why you can see when it is delayed, we have a main oscillation. And if you remember, in the time of the pandemic, we had a lot of waves. And this also can be can appear in the model when you consider these types of delays. Also here for the epidemiology about the vaccine, for example, to have the first dose and the second dose, and to understand the best moment to have the first dose and the second dose for optimization. Again, the delay is very important because it can be viewed as delay in the equation, the time between the first dose and the second dose. So here we have a lot of applications in epidemiology, like Zika, also HIV, so many types of disease. Also now we know about the artificial intelligence that is very important nowadays. And if you see behind of the artificial intelligence, what we have is processing data. And what we like is that this processing data is very fast. And there are several models, and including one very recent paper from Professor Christine from Hungary using state-dependent delay to understand this processing data. Because if you see, if you open your computer and if you try to open many things at the same time, what will happen with your computer? It will take longer to processing the data because you are sending many data. So this delay depends on the state. It's a type of state-dependent delay. So Professor Christine from Hungary, he published one paper that brings exactly this model about processing data using state-dependent delay. It's very recent, and it opens a lot for this part of artificial intelligence. Also, I investigated during my stay in Germany one model for exchange rates. So we know about the dollar, euro. We know that it's the fluctuation of these rates. And again, it's not instantaneously, but it takes time, and this influences what will happen. And again, we have a model that brought a neutral type of equation with a state-dependent delay, working with this exchange rate. And this is also very important here. The climate change is one of the global challenges. And again, the delay is very important if you work with like a transport equation in order to understand this what's happening with the climate. And again, you can insert it delay in type of this type of equation. And it's very, very important. So there are many people that work in climate change that have many models, including delay. So delay appears in many, many things. However, of course, it's sometimes hard to do them. So let's back to our generalized ODE, now that everybody are a little familiar with functional differential equation. And our goal is to relate this type of equation with a generalized ODE. So here we have a little more general type of equation. So here we have functional differential equations with measure. So we have YF, if you remember before, it's a function of the partial derivative. And here is this initial condition, and we would like to relate it with a generalized ODE. But here I pay attention for one thing. So if you remember before, the relation between generalized ODEs and measured differential equations was very simple. There you have the capital F equal 1 integral. However, here, since we're dealing with this type of equation, we need a more sophisticated definition of our capital F. So here, this is the definition of our capital F from the generalized ODE. So if we define our capital F equal these three integrals here, so the first one is 0 and then these two integrals, then what we have a relation between the solutions of the measured differential equation and the generalized ODE. And here are the types of conditions that we have for our function that are more general than bounded and Lipschitz. Because if you see here, the bounded that we require is under the integral and is including functions. And then here the same happens for the Lipschitz. So here we can have a much more general type of conditions for our function. And then what we have is the following. So if y is the solution of the measure functional differential equation, then if we define our x depending on y, we have that x is the solution of the generalized ODE. And the same happens here. If you have the x is the solution of the generalized ODE, then you can define y depend on x, and you can find the solution for your measure differential equation. So you have this relation between these two types of equations. So, also one thing that is nice is because inside of this measure functional differential equation, we can also include the impulses. And this is something that is very nice because we can have these impulses inside, and impulses again brings a lot of generality in terms of models. Just to mention, for example, the nesting again, if you take a dose, each dose can be viewed as an impulse that you get so in your equation. So there are many types of models that investigated the nesting. So these could be viewed as impulses when you take the dose. Also about the heartbeat, again, you also can be viewed as impulses, especially if you need to do something for your heart comeback. So this can be viewed as impulses. So there are many models for impulses also. And here, what we have, we would like to relate this type of equation with delay and also with impulses with measure functional differential equation. So here are some conditions that we have. So we have that our g is a left continuous function and no decreasing. And here are the moments of impulses. And then what's happening is the following. So since our g here, we ask that our g is continuous at the moment of impulses. What happens is that this integral, this integral, is also continuous at the moment of impulses. And then we can rewrite our problem in this integral form. So using that, we have a relation between both. So here, what we have, if you define f tilde equal f in all the intervals except in the moment of impulses, and equal the operators of impulses in the moment of impulses. And if you define a b tilde equal g except by a constant, what we have is a relation between these equations with impulses and this other one without impulses. So we have an equivalence between them. So, and since this last one can be related with a generalized ODE, we can also relate this other one with a generalized ODE. So we can have a relation between equations with impulses, and generalized OD as well. Also, this is the last one type of equations that I will mention today. It's about dynamic equations on time scales that also we can include inside of generalized OD. And only to give some ideas what the dynamic equation time scale, this comes from the theory of time scale, and this theory, the main idea behind it to unify many types of equations. And here we have this citation from Eric Saint Bell in this book, Man of Mathematics, mentioned that in that time the major test of mathematics was to harmonize the continuous and the discrete. We know that many people work in continuous time and the other people work in the discrete time. And the main idea was to think how to unify both theories in order to prove just one result and have a consequence for continuous and then for discrete. And this was the idea behind Stephen Hilger. Here is the Bernard Delbach, his advisor, and Stephen Hilger, in his PhD thesis, he created this theory that the dynamic equation time scale, and he had the goal to encompass continuous and discrete in the same equation. Let's call it dynamic equation time scale. However, our time scale is much more than that, because the definition of time scale is only an empty and closed subset of the real numbers. So we can have many types of time scales. So if you have your time scale with the real number set, we have the continuous case. If you have the integer number set, we have the discrete case. However, you can have counter sets, you can have union or closed intervals, you can have hybrid styles. So we can have much more than only continuous and discrete time. So here, so we can have much more than that, including also the quantum scale that's more important for quantum physics. So also we can have this inside of this theory. So, and I will not pass very in detail in this part, but only to mention that everything here changed, like the definition of the derivative will change. Also, you need some operators in order to do this theory. So here are some operators that we need. We also, depending on these operators, we can have the definitions of the points. And here are examples of time scale, including this HD. It's very important for numerical simulation because we can do with the computer using HD. And then if you do 8 goes to 0, you have that your solution also goes to the continuous solution. So you have the discrete and then you can go to the continuous. And there are several things that you can do in that method. So also we need to deal here with this gradient function in order to define the derivative. And also we have a special type of analogues for continuous function. So here are more like here's the definition of the derivative that's very similar to what we have usually for the derivative, but with this definition, we can encompass in one definition both the discrete and continuous definition of the derivative. So here is the way that we have when you have the right expected point, that's the case of discrete. So this is the formula for your delta derivative, and then here is the one that's when you have the right set, when you have continuous case. So from the definition, we can have these two equalities. So now what is the nice here is because we can relate the measured differential equations with dynamic equation time scales, which means that we can also relate the dynamic equation time scales with generalized OD. These measured differential equations can be related with generalized OD. So in order to do that, we need to define this operator, that's the star operator, that's the interim of the point in time scale, such that bigger or equal t. And since our time scale can be wholes, because the zeta, also you can be wholes inside of the time scale, we need to define the extension of the time scale that the time scale is star. that minus infinity until the supreme of time scale if the supreme is finite, and if the real line if you have the supremacy infinite. So here also we need to define the extension of the function. So here we have a function that's defined from the time scale, and we can define the extension of the function that's defining the extension of the time scale. And with this in hand, so here only to mention, here is the function that's defined on the time scale, and using the definition, we can cover all these holes which appear. It's important because we would like to relate something that's defined on time scale, and the other thing that is defined is the real line. So you needed to cover these holes in order to have this relation between both. Then here is the relation. So we have that this function here, we have that the integral that in the sense of a Kurzweil, hence of delta integral, and we have a relation with a tilt integral. So we can have this relation between both, and from this relation, we can have a relation between the solution of both problems. So here, if you have a solution for the dynamic equation time scale, we can have that the extension will be a solution of the measured differential equation. And also we can do the other way around. So if you have the solution for the measured differential equation, you know that it has the form like x star. So when we have that x is the solution of your dynamic equation time scale. So we can have both. And again, we can put everything then inside of generalizable. So, from these types of results, we could prove many types of results from that. We have results concerning, we could prove periodic and no periodic aberration principles for those types of equations. So we proved that for generalizability, and then we could translate these results to other types of equations. Also, continuous dependence on parameters, we could prove for generalizability, we could improve the results that exist and translate them to all those types of equations. The same about the prolongation of solutions, stability, many types of problems we could do using this relation with a generalizability. So now I will only comment a little about some of the developing problem. So now, as you saw, we have this big set that the generalizability, and we are trying to start putting more equations inside of generalizability. And we succeeded to prove a relation between stochastic equations and generalizability. Now we are trying to prove a relation between fractional differential equation and generalizability. And the idea behind that is using Volterra integral equation, because when you have Volterra equations, we have that the fractional is a specific case for Volterra, because depending how you define your kernel, you can have a fractional. So we are trying to do that using Volterra equation. And the one that's open, always open questions about how to relate partial differential equations and the generalized ODE. This is a still open question. I believe that it's possible, but not in the classical sense of solution for the partial differential equation, but using like the weak formulation for the solution. Because when you do the weak formulation, you are dealing with a type of integral equation. And I believe that it would be possible to relate it with generalized ODE. However, it's still an open problem, so people that are interested to investigate this type of problems, which is benign. Also here for the delay equation, and it's also possible to combine delay equations with partial differential equations. We have some results in that direction, that we have like Lamé equations with delays, because there are many phenomena that can be viewed as partial differential equations and also needed to put delay in time. So there are many types that we can use. Even for example, for cancer models, for cancer population, cancer cells, if you see, they are described by partial differential equations. And again, you need to put the delay because we know that the reproduction of the cancer cells are not instantaneously, but it takes time to reproduce them. So these again can be viewed as delay equations. So there are many open problems in this direction. Also, Paul now is working in manifolds now, stable, yes, for generalized ODEs. So there are many open problems for generalized ODEs that you can think because it's a relatively new theory. That can happen with dynamic equation time scales. There are several open problems in the direction like the part of same groups theory is also open in the sense. So there are a lot of things that can be done in this direction. So many open problems to think it for generalized ODEs and all those types of equations. And as I mentioned, the good thing is that you can translate all those results that you prove for generalized ODEs to other types of equations. And this is usually very nice. So yeah, here's all the problems. I think I mentioned all of them for you. And also just to mention, we also are working with the relation between generalized ODEs and the neutral type of equation. That means delay equations, but with the derivatives in the part of the delay. That's much more complicated. And we are trying to do that with the state dependently. And it's still open, but we are working on it to establish this type of relation. Yeah, so thank you very much for your attention.